When 17-year-old Clara May was dragged into the town square by her drunken father and sold like livestock to pay his debts, she thought her life was over. But what the mysterious mountain man who bought her for a single silver dollar would do next would shock everyone, including Clara herself. This is a story of redemption, unexpected love, and the power of human dignity in the face of cruelty. Stay with me until the end to see how this incredible journey unfolds, and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story travels. The autumn wind cut through Silver Creek like a blade, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and broken dreams. Clara May Hutchins pressed herself against the rough wooden wall of Brennan's General Store, her swollen belly making it difficult to find any position that didn't send sharp pains shooting through her back. At 17, she should have been thinking about harvest dances and Sunday picnics, but instead she was hiding from the cruel stares and whispered judgments of a town that had already condemned her. There she is. The voice belonged to her father, Thomas Hutchins, and it slurred with the familiar poison of cheap whiskey. "Come on out, girl, time to face the music." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as heavy footsteps approached. She knew this moment would come eventually. For weeks, her father had been drinking away what little money they had left, and the debts had been piling up like snow in a mountain pass. But she never imagined it would come to this. "Please, Papa," she whispered as his weathered hand grabbed her arm with bruising force. "Don't do this. We can find another way." "Another way?" Thomas laughed bitterly, his breath reeking of alcohol and desperation. "You think there's another way out of this mess you've made? You think anyone in this town would hire the likes of you carrying another man's bastard?" The words hit Clara like physical blows. She stumbled as he dragged her toward the town square where a small crowd was already beginning to gather. Word traveled fast in Silver Creek, especially when it involved scandal and shame. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thomas called out, his voice carrying across the square with the practiced boom of a man who had once been a respected merchant. "Step right up. I've got something here that might interest you." Clara felt the blood drain from her face as more people emerged from shops and houses drawn by the commotion like vultures to carrion. She recognized most of the faces: Mrs. Patterson from the millinery shop, old Jake Morrison, who ran the livery stable, the Hendricks family, who owned the largest farm outside town. These were people who had once smiled at her in church, who had bought ribbons and buttons from her father's store when times were better. Now they looked at her with a mixture of disgust, pity, and morbid curiosity. "What's this about, Tom?" called out Mayor Whitfield, a portly man with a silver watch chain that caught the afternoon light. "You can't just drag that girl out here and—" "I can do whatever I damn well please with my own daughter," Thomas shot back, tightening his grip on Clara's arm. "Especially when she's the reason I'm about to lose everything." A murmur rippled through the growing crowd. Clara wanted to sink into the ground, to disappear entirely. The baby in her belly seemed to sense her distress, kicking restlessly against her ribs. "See, folks," Thomas continued, his voice taking on the tone of a carnival barker. "My daughter here got herself into trouble. Carrying some man's child she is, and he's long gone. Won't even tell me who the father is. Now I've got creditors breathing down my neck and the bank's fixing to take my store. So I figure it's time Clara here started pulling her weight." "Papa, please," Clara whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Don't." "Quiet," Thomas snapped, then turned back to the crowd with a grotesque smile. "I'm offering her services to anyone willing to pay. She may not be much to look at, what with her condition and all, but she's strong enough for kitchen work, laundry, whatever needs doing. And in a few months, you'll get a bonus, an extra pair of hands to help around the place." The crowd had grown to nearly 50 people now, and their shocked murmurs filled the air like angry bees. Clara saw the faces of people she had known her entire life, and in their eyes, she saw everything from horror to hunger. "This is barbaric." Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her face flushed with indignation. "Thomas Hutchins, you ought to be ashamed of yourself." "Ashamed?" Thomas laughed harshly. I'm not the one who spread my legs for some traveling man and then refused to name him when he disappeared. The slap came so fast that Clara barely saw Mrs. Patterson's hand move. The sound cracked across the square like a gunshot, and Thomas stumbled backward, his cheek bearing the red mark of her palm. "How dare you speak of your own child that way?" Mrs. Patterson's voice shook with rage. "Clara is a good girl who made one mistake. You're supposed to protect her, not parade her around like livestock." But Thomas was beyond shame now, beyond reason. The whiskey and desperation had burned away whatever paternal instincts he might have once possessed. He rubbed his cheek and spat into the dust. "Protect her? Who's going to protect me when I'm living in the street? Who's going to pay my debts? She made her choice, now she can live with the consequences." From the back of the crowd, a voice called out, "How much you asking, Tom?" All heads turned toward the speaker, Barrett Sloan, the richest rancher in 3 counties. He was a man in his 50s with silver hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to take inventory of everything they saw. His expensive suit and polished boots marked him as someone who was used to getting what he wanted. Clara's blood turned to ice. She had heard stories about Barrett Sloan, whispered tales of young women who went to work at his ranch and were never quite the same afterward. His wife had died years ago, and he lived alone in his sprawling house with only his hired hands for company. "Well now, Mr. Sloan," Thomas said, his voice suddenly oily with false respect, "I was thinking maybe $50 for her services. Until the baby comes, then we could renegotiate." 50. Sloan stepped closer, his eyes moving over Clara like she was a piece of merchandise. "For a pregnant girl who can barely stand straight, I'd say 25, and that's generous." "Now wait just a minute," Thomas began. 30, came another voice from the crowd. This belonged to Jake Morrison, whose eyes held a different kind of hunger than Sloan's. "I could use help with the horses, and my wife's been dead 3 years now." The bidding had begun, and Clara felt her world collapse around her like a house of cards. These men weren't just talking about work. They were talking about ownership, about possession. The looks in their eyes made her skin crawl, and she instinctively wrapped her arms around her swollen belly. 35, called out another voice. 40, 45. The numbers flew back and forth while Clara stood frozen in the center of it all, feeling less human with each bid. The baby kicked again, and she wondered if it could somehow sense the danger they were in. $60. Barrett Sloan's voice cut through the others like a knife. "And that's my final offer, Tom. Take it or leave it." A hush fell over the crowd. $60 was more money than most people in Silver Creek saw in 6 months. Thomas's eyes lit up with greed, and Clara knew her fate was sealed. "Sold," Thomas declared, reaching out his hand toward Sloan. "She's all yours, Barrett." But before Sloan could step forward to claim his prize, another voice spoke from the edge of the crowd. It was quiet, almost conversational, but somehow it carried clearly across the square. $1. Every head turned toward the speaker. He stood apart from the crowd, tall and lean, with dark hair that hung to his shoulders and a beard that hadn't seen a razor in weeks. His clothes were simple worn leather and rough wool, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who spent more time with trees and mountains than with people. Clara had never seen him before, but she knew who he must be. The mountain man. The hermit who lived somewhere up in the high country and came to town maybe twice a year for supplies. Most folks called him crazy, said he talked to ghosts and wrestled with bears. Jonah Briggs was his name, she remembered now. There were a dozen stories about him, each more outlandish than the last. The crowd began to laugh. A few people pointed and whispered. Barrett Sloan's face turned red with indignation. $1, Sloan sputtered. "You can't be serious, you mad fool." Jonah stepped closer, his pale gray eyes never leaving Clara's face. There was something in his gaze, not hunger or possession, but something else entirely, something that might have been understanding. $1 silver. he repeated, reaching into his pocket and producing a worn coin that gleamed in the afternoon light. American silver minted in 1855. That's absurd, Thomas exploded. Sloane offered 60. I heard him, Jonah said calmly, but I wasn't talking to Mr. Sloane. He walked forward until he stood directly in front of Clara. Up close, she could see that his eyes were the color of storm clouds, and despite his wild appearance, they held a kindness that she hadn't seen in so long she'd almost forgotten what it looked like. "What's your name, miss?" he asked softly. "Clara," she stammered. "Clara May." "Clara May," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "That's a pretty name. Tell me, Clara May, do you want to go with Mr. Sloane?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Clara glanced at Barrett Sloane, saw the cold calculation in his eyes, the way his gaze lingered on her body. Then she looked back at the mountain man, at this stranger who had asked her what she wanted when no one else seemed to care. "No," she whispered. "Then don't," Jonah said simply. He turned to face Thomas, the silver dollar still gleaming in his palm. "I'm making an offer for your daughter's freedom, not her servitude. $1 to cancel whatever debt you think she owes you. $1 to let her choose her own path." "That's not how this works." Sloane stepped forward, his face purple with rage. "Tom, you can't seriously consider it's $1 more than anyone else has put on the table." Jonah interrupted, his voice still calm but with an edge of steel beneath it. "Unless someone else wants to make a higher offer for Clara May's freedom." The crowd fell silent. They had come expecting entertainment, maybe a bit of scandal to gossip about over dinner. They hadn't expected this, a challenge to the very nature of what they were witnessing. "This is ridiculous." Sloane turned to the crowd, appealing for support. "The girl owes her father money. She's carrying a bastard child. She needs guidance, structure, someone to take her in hand." "She needs compassion," said a new voice from the crowd. Everyone turned to see Reverend Wickham pushing through, the people, his black coat and white collar marking him as clearly as a flag. "This whole spectacle is an abomination in the eyes of God." The Reverend was a small man with thinning hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, but his voice carried the authority of his calling. He looked around the crowd with obvious disappointment. "Are we so lost to decency that we would auction a young woman like a piece of livestock? Where is our Christian charity? Where is our humanity?" "Save your sermons for Sunday preacher," Thomas snapped. "This is business." "This is sin," Wickham replied firmly, "and I'll have no part in it." The Reverend's words seemed to break whatever spell had held the crowd. People began to shift uncomfortably, avoiding each other's eyes. A few started to drift away, suddenly finding urgent business elsewhere. But Barrett Sloane wasn't finished. He stepped closer to Jonah, his hands clenched into fists. "You think you're some kind of hero, mountain man? You think saving one whore is going to wash the blood off your hands?" Jonah went very still. The change in him was subtle but unmistakable, like a wolf that had just caught a threatening scent. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What did you call her?" "You heard me," Sloane said, emboldened by what he thought was Jonah's weakness. "Everyone knows what she is, what she's done. You want to take in a pregnant whore, that's your business, but don't pretend you're doing something noble." The punch came so fast that later people would argue about whether they actually saw it happen. One moment Sloane was standing there with his mouth open, and the next he was sprawled in the dust with blood streaming from his nose. Jonah flexed his fingers and looked down at the fallen man with no more emotion than if he'd swatted a fly. "Her name," he said quietly, "is Clara May. Use it." Sloane struggled to his feet, his expensive suit now covered in dirt and blood. His eyes blazed with humiliation and rage. "You'll pay for this, Briggs. You think you can come down from your mountain and—" "The offer stands," Jonah interrupted, turning back to Thomas. He held out the silver dollar. $1 for your daughter's freedom, yes or no?" Thomas looked from the coin to Sloane, to the dispersing crowd, to his daughter's tear-stained face. For a moment, Clara thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, perhaps a shadow of the man he used to be. the father who had once read her bedtime stories and taught her to count coins in the store. But then his hand shot out and snatched the dollar from Jonah's palm. "Sold," he said, not meeting Clara's eyes. "She's your problem now." And just like that, Clara's life changed forever. She stood in the town square surrounded by the debris of her former existence, belonging to a man she'd never met. But as Jonah Briggs offered her his arm with the courtesy of a gentleman escorting a lady to dinner, she realized something that surprised her. For the first time in months, she wasn't afraid. "Come on, Clara May," Jonah said gently. "Let's go home." As they walked away from the square, leaving behind the whispers and stares and the man who had been her father, Clara felt the baby kick again. But this time, it didn't feel like distress. It felt like hope. The crowd gradually dispersed, people returning to their shops and homes, with plenty to talk about over supper. Barrett Sloane stood alone in the square, blood still trickling from his nose, watching the mountain man and the pregnant girl disappear down the dusty road. His eyes were cold as winter ice, and anyone who knew him well would have recognized the look. It was the same expression he wore when planning to acquire a new piece of land or eliminate a business rival. Barrett Sloane was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully, and he had a long memory for those who crossed him. But for now, Clara walked beside her unlikely savior, each step taking her further from the life that had nearly destroyed her and closer to something she couldn't yet name. The autumn wind still cut through the valley, but somehow it no longer felt quite so cold. Behind them, Silver Creek settled back into its normal rhythms, the scandal of the afternoon already being woven into the fabric of local legend. But ahead lay the mountains, ancient and patient, keeping their secrets among the pines and granite peaks. And in the growing dusk, as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Clara May Hutchins walked toward her new life with a man who had bought her freedom for the price of a silver dollar. The real story was just beginning. The wagon wheels creaked a steady rhythm against the mountain road as they climbed higher into the wilderness. Clara clutched the rough wooden seat, her knuckles white with the effort of staying upright as the vehicle swayed over rocks and ruts. Beside her, Jonah Briggs guided his two sturdy horses with gentle words and an easy hand on the reins, as if this treacherous path were nothing more than a Sunday drive through town. "Easy there, Belle. Watch that root, Duke." His voice carried a warmth when he spoke to the animals that Clara had rarely heard, directed toward any living creature. It was such a contrast to the cold transaction she'd just witnessed in the town square that she found herself stealing glances at his weathered profile. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the creak of leather and the soft snorting of the horses. Clara's mind raced with questions and fears, but every time she opened her mouth to speak, the words seemed to stick in her throat. "What did you say to a man who had just purchased your freedom with a silver dollar? What did you say to a stranger who was taking you, God only knew where, into the mountains where no one would ever hear you scream? You're wondering if you've traded one kind of hell for another," Jonah said suddenly, as if he could read her thoughts. His eyes remained fixed on the narrow trail ahead, but there was understanding in his voice. "Can't say I blame you for that. Mountain man buys a pregnant girl from her drunken father. Sounds like the beginning of a cautionary tale mothers tell their daughters." Clara's breath caught in her throat. The directness of his words should have frightened her, but instead she found herself responding to the honesty in them. "The thought had occurred to me," she admitted quietly. Jonah nodded, navigating around a fallen branch that blocked part of the path. "Good. Shows you've got sense. Too many folks go through life never questioning anything, never wondering if things might be different than they appear." "And are they?" Clara asked, surprised by her own boldness. "Different than they appear." For the first time since they'd left town, Jonah looked directly at her. His gray eyes were serious but not unkind, and Clara saw something in them that she couldn't quite name, a deep sadness, perhaps, or an old pain that had settled into the lines around his eyes, like dust in the corners of a long, unused room. "I suppose you'll have to decide that for yourself," he said, But I can tell you this much, I didn't buy you, Clara May. I bought your freedom. There's a difference, though. I understand it might not feel that way right now." "What's the difference?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended, edged with all the hurt and confusion of the day's events. Jonah was quiet for a long moment, considering his words as carefully as he considered the rocky path ahead. A purchase implies ownership. Freedom implies choice. When we get to my cabin, you'll have choices to make. You can stay or you can go. You can work if you want to earn your keep, or you can rest if that's what you need. You can tell me your story, or you can keep it to yourself." "And if I choose to leave?" Clara asked, testing the boundaries of this supposed freedom. "Then I'll give you supplies and directions to wherever you want to go," Jonah replied without hesitation, "though I'd recommend waiting until after the baby comes. These mountains can be unforgiving, especially to someone in your condition." Clara fell silent again, trying to process this unexpected kindness. In her experience, men who helped women always expected something in return, and the price was usually more than the woman could afford to pay. But there was something in Jonah's manner, a quiet sincerity, that made her want to believe him. The trail began to level out as they reached a plateau nestled between two towering peaks. Ancient pines stretched toward the sky like cathedral spires, their branches filtering the late afternoon sunlight into patterns of gold and shadow. The air was thinner here, crisp with the promise of winter, and so clean it almost hurt to breathe after years of breathing the dust and smoke of town. "It's beautiful," Clara whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "It is that." Jonah agreed, and for the first time since she'd met him, she heard something approaching contentment in his voice. "Been living up here for nigh on 8 years now, and it still takes my breath away sometimes. The silence especially. You forget how loud the world can be until you find yourself somewhere this quiet." As if to prove his point, the only sounds were the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant cry of a hawk circling high above. Clara had lived her entire life surrounded by the constant noise of civilization voices and wagon wheels and hammering and barking dogs and crying babies. She'd never realized how much space true silence could create in a person's mind. "Why do you live alone up here?" she asked, then immediately regretted the question. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't pry." "No harm in asking," Jonah said, though his voice had grown more guarded. "Sometimes a man needs to get away from people for a while. Sometimes that while turns into years." There was a story there Clara could tell, but she sensed it wasn't one he was ready to share. Instead, she asked, "Don't you get lonely?" Jonah was quiet for so long that Clara began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Lonely's better than some alternatives." The wagon crested a small rise, and suddenly Clara could see their destination. Nestled in a natural clearing surrounded by towering pines sat a log cabin that looked like something from a fairy tale. It was larger than she'd expected, with a stone chimney sending a thin curl of smoke into the evening air. A small garden plot showed the brown stalks of plants that had been carefully tended through the growing season, and a well-built barn suggested the presence of more animals than just the 2 horses pulling their wagon. "Home," Jonah said simply. As they drew closer, Clara could see that the cabin was built with obvious care and skill. The logs were perfectly fitted, the chinking between them neat and weather-tight. Window boxes that had probably held flowers during the summer months sat empty but ready for next year's blooms. A wide porch ran across the front of the building with 2 rocking chairs positioned to catch the morning sun. It looked like a place where happiness could live. The horses seemed to know they were home, picking up their pace as they approached the barn. A large yellow dog came bounding out to greet them, tail wagging so hard it seemed to propel his entire body from side to side. "That's Bear," Jonah said, climbing down from the wagon with easy grace. "He's got more enthusiasm than sense, but he's good company." Bear immediately focused his attention on Clara, who was still sitting frozen in the wagon seat. She'd always been nervous around dogs, and this one was easily the largest she'd ever seen. "He won't hurt you," Jonah assured her, then called to the dog, "Bear, sit." The massive animal immediately planted his hindquarters on the ground, though his tail continued to sweep the dirt behind him, and his tongue lolled out in what was unmistakably a grin. "May I help you down?" Jonah asked, extending his hand to Clara. The simple courtesy of the question, the fact that he'd asked permission, instead of simply grabbing her, nearly brought tears to her eyes. When was the last time anyone had treated her with such basic respect? "Thank you," she managed, accepting his hand. Jonah helped her down from the wagon with gentle care, mindful of her condition. His hands were calloused from years of hard work, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. Once her feet were on solid ground, he immediately stepped back, giving her space. "Let me get the horses settled, then I'll show you inside," he said. "Feel free to look around. Get your bearings." Clara watched as he unhitched the team, with practiced efficiency, speaking to each animal in low, soothing tones. It was clear that he cared for them well. Their coats gleamed with health, and they responded to his touch with obvious trust and affection. Bear had apparently decided that Clara was acceptable because he approached slowly and gently, bumped his massive head against her hand. Despite her nervousness, she found herself smiling as she scratched behind his ears. "You're a good boy, aren't you?" she murmured, and Bear's tail wagged even harder. "He likes you," Jonah observed, leading the horses toward the barn. "Bear's a pretty good judge of character." While Jonah tended to the animals, Clara explored the immediate area around the cabin. Everything she saw spoke of a man who took pride in his surroundings. Firewood was stacked in neat rows under a protective overhang. Tools hung in orderly rows inside the barn. Even the small vegetable garden, now dormant for winter, showed signs of careful planning and attention. But there were other details that caught her eye as well. A smaller rocking chair on the porch, sized for a child. A swing hanging from the sturdy branch of a nearby oak tree, its ropes weathered but still strong. Flower boxes that had been built to accommodate more than just one person's enjoyment. This hadn't always been a bachelor's retreat. Someone else had lived here once, someone Jonah had cared enough about to build things for, to share this beautiful isolation with. "Ready to see inside?" Jonah asked, appearing at her elbow, with Bear trotting along beside him. Clara nodded, following him up the porch steps. The front door was made of heavy oak and fitted with a beautiful wrought iron latch that looked like it had been crafted by hand. "Did you make that?" she asked, running her fingers over the intricate metalwork. The latch, "Yes, I've got a forge set up behind the barn, helps pass the winter months." He opened the door and gestured for her to enter first. Clara stepped inside and immediately felt her breath catch in her throat. The interior of the cabin was nothing like what she'd expected. Instead of the rough, sparse accommodations she'd imagined, she found herself in a comfortable, well-appointed home. The main room featured a large stone fireplace, with a warm fire crackling behind an iron screen. Comfortable furniture was arranged to take advantage of both the fireplace and the windows that let in the fading daylight. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with more volumes than she'd ever seen outside of the town library. "It's wonderful," she breathed, turning slowly to take it all in. "Kitchen's through there," Jonah said, pointing to an archway that led to another room. "Bedroom's upstairs, but there's also a smaller room down here that you might find more comfortable considering." He gestured vaguely toward her swollen belly. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. Even this kind man's tactful reference to her condition was enough to remind her of her shame. "I don't want to put you out of your own room," she said quickly. "You won't be. I mostly sleep upstairs anyway. The downstairs room has been—" He paused, and that shadow of old pain flickered across his face again. "It hasn't been used in a while. Might do it good to have someone in it again." Before Clara could ask what he meant, Bear suddenly lifted his head and let out a low growl. Both humans turned toward the sound, and Jonah immediately moved to the window. "Someone's coming up the trail," he said, his voice sharp with tension. "Moving fast." Clara's heart began to race. Could it be trouble from town? Jonah was already moving toward a rifle that hung above the fireplace. Could be, or it could be someone who needs help. Either way, I want you to stay inside until I know which. Jonah! A voice called from outside, and Clara could hear the thunder of hoofbeats approaching rapidly. Jonah Briggs. That's Doc Mason, Jonah said, relaxing slightly but not replacing the rifle. Wonder what brings him up here in such a hurry. He opened the door as a horse and rider came into view. The man in the saddle was elderly, with white hair and a black medical bag strapped behind him. His face was flushed from the hard ride, and his usually neat appearance was disheveled. Doc, Jonah called out, what's got you riding like the devil's after you? Dr. Mason dismounted with the stiffness of a man whose joints weren't as young as his spirit. It's about the girl, Jonah, the one you took from town today. Clara felt ice form in her stomach. What about me? The doctor looked at her with kind eyes, but his expression was grave. I'm afraid there's been talk, miss. Lot of angry talk. Barrett Sloane's been making noise about how you were stolen from him, how the whole transaction wasn't legal. That's nonsense, Jonah said firmly. Her father took my money fair and square in front of half the town. I know that, and you know that, Doc Mason replied. But Sloane's got influence, and he's got money. He's been talking to Judge Morrison, claiming that Tom Hutchins wasn't in his right mind, that the whole thing was a farce. Judge Morrison. Clara's voice was barely a whisper. But he was there. He saw what happened. Morrison owes Sloane money, the doctor explained grimly. Has for years. And Sloane's not the forgiving type when it comes to debts. Jonah's jaw tightened. What exactly is Sloane claiming? He's saying the girl belongs to him by right of the original transaction. Says your dollar was just interference in a legitimate business dealing. He's demanding that she be returned to him immediately. Clara sank into the nearest chair, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. The brief taste of safety and kindness she'd experienced was already slipping away, replaced by the familiar terror of being trapped with no way out. Over my dead body, Jonah said quietly, and something in his tone made even Bear look up with interest. Jonah, I'm on your side here, but you need to understand what you're up against, Doc Mason said urgently. Sloane's got half the town council in his pocket. He's talking about sending the sheriff up here to collect her. Let him send the sheriff, Jonah replied. I've got nothing to hide. Maybe not, but Sloane does. And men like him don't like being made to look foolish in public. That punch you gave him, that's just made things worse. Clara looked back and forth between the two men, feeling like a bone being fought over by dogs. Maybe I should just go back, she said quietly. If it would prevent trouble. No. Jonah's voice cut through her words like a blade. You're not going anywhere you don't want to go. Not while I'm alive to prevent it. The vehemence in his voice surprised all three of them. Doc Mason raised an eyebrow, and even Bear seemed to sense the sudden tension in the room. Son, the doctor said carefully, I understand you want to help this girl, but think about what you're saying. You can't fight the whole town. I'm not fighting the whole town, Jonah replied. I'm fighting one greedy bastard who thinks he can buy and sell human beings. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. When was the last time anyone had fought for her? When had anyone cared enough to stand between her and harm? There might be another way, Doc Mason said slowly, something that would make it harder for Sloane to claim any right to the girl. What kind of something? Jonah asked. The doctor looked uncomfortable, glancing between Jonah and Clara. Well, if she were married, for instance, if she had a husband to speak for her to claim her protection, the suggestion hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace. Clara felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and something else, a flutter of something that might have been hope. That's assuming anyone would want to marry a pregnant woman with no family and no prospects, she said bitterly. Clara, Jonah said quietly, and when she looked up, his gray eyes were serious and intent. Would you consider it a marriage of convenience just to keep you safe? The words hit her like a physical blow. Not because they were cruel, but because they were kind. Here was this man, this stranger, who had already sacrificed his solitude and his peace of mind for her, offering to sacrifice even more. "I couldn't ask you to do that," she whispered. "You're not asking, I'm offering. But you don't know anything about me. You don't know what I've done, who the father of this baby is. I know you're brave enough to stand up to your father when he tried to sell you like livestock." Jonah interrupted. "I know you're kind enough to worry about putting me in danger rather than thinking only of your own safety. That's enough for me." Doc Mason cleared his throat. "I hate to interrupt, but if we're going to do this, we need to do it tonight. Sloane's planning to ride up here tomorrow with the sheriff." "Tonight?" Clara's voice cracked on the word. "I can perform the ceremony," the doctor continued. "I'm licensed to officiate marriages in the territory. It would be completely legal and binding." Clara's mind reeled. This morning she'd been her father's unwanted burden. This afternoon she'd been sold like a piece of property. Now she was being offered marriage to a man she'd known for less than 4 hours. "I need some air," she said abruptly, standing up so quickly that spots danced in front of her eyes. "Clara." Jonah started forward, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Please, I just need a moment to think." She stepped out onto the porch with Bear following close behind. The night air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and wood smoke. Above her, stars were beginning to appear. In the darkening sky, more stars than she'd ever seen from town, where the lights obscured all but the brightest. Behind her, she could hear the low murmur of voices as Jonah and Doc Mason discussed the situation. She caught fragments, "Not safe for her in town," and "Sloane won't give up easily," and "Baby will need protection too." The baby. Clara placed her hands on her swollen belly, feeling the small life moving restlessly inside her. What kind of future could she offer this child? What kind of life awaited a bastard born to a woman with no family, no money, no prospects, but here in this beautiful place, with this kind man, there might be a chance for something better. Not love. Perhaps she wasn't naive enough to expect that, but safety, respect, a chance for her child to grow up without the stain of illegitimacy. "What do you think, little one?" she whispered to her unborn baby. "Should we trust him?" As if in answer, the baby kicked gently, and Clara chose to take it as approval. When she returned to the cabin, both men looked up at her with anxious expressions. "If I agree to this," she said carefully, "what would you expect from me? What would this marriage really mean?" Jonah considered the question seriously. "It would mean you'd have my name and my protection. You'd have a home here for as long as you wanted it. As for expectations..." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I'd expect honesty between us and basic kindness. I'd expect you to pull your weight around here as much as your condition allows. Beyond that, we'd figure things out as we go. And the baby would be mine in the eyes of the law," Jonah said, without hesitation. "No one could ever question its legitimacy or your right to keep it." Clara felt tears spill down her cheeks, but for the first time in months, they weren't tears of despair. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." The ceremony was simple and strange, conducted by lamplight in a cabin that smelled of pine logs and wood smoke. Doc Mason read from a well-worn prayer book he carried in his medical bag, while Bear sat at attention as if he understood the solemnity of the occasion. When it came time for rings, Jonah disappeared upstairs for a moment and returned with a simple gold band that he placed gently on Clara's finger. It was slightly too large, but it caught the lamplight and seemed to glow with its own inner fire. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Doc Mason said, closing his prayer book with a snap. "You may kiss the bride." An awkward silence fell over the room. Clara looked up at Jonah, suddenly aware that she was now married to this man, bound to him by law and custom. He looked down at her with those storm-gray eyes, and she saw something flicker in them, uncertainty perhaps, or question. He leaned down and pressed his lips gently to her forehead, a chaste kiss that spoke of respect rather than passion. "Thank you," he whispered so quietly that only she could hear. "Thank you," she whispered back. Doc Mason packed up his prayer book and prepared to leave, accepting Jonah's offer of a meal, but declining the offer to stay the night. "I need to get back to town," he explained. "Spread the word about the marriage before Sloan can make his move. The more people who know about it, the harder it'll be for him to claim it didn't happen." After the doctor left, Clara and Jonah found themselves alone together for the first time as husband and wife. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of what they'd just done. "Are you hungry?" Jonah asked finally. "I could fix something to eat." "That would be nice," Clara replied, grateful for something practical to focus on. She followed him into the kitchen, a comfortable room with a large wood-burning stove and shelves lined with preserves and supplies. Jonah moved around the space with easy familiarity, putting together a simple meal of bread, cheese, and soup from a pot that had been simmering on the stove. "Venison stew," he explained, ladling the fragrant mixture into bowls. "Shot the deer myself last week." They ate in companionable silence, and Clara was surprised to discover how hungry she was. The stress of the day had left her feeling hollow, and the warm food helped to settle both her stomach and her nerves. "The ring," she said suddenly, looking down at the gold band on her finger. "It's beautiful, was it?" "My mother's," Jonah said quietly. "She died when I was 12. My father gave it to me before he passed, said maybe someday I'd find someone who could wear it." Clara twisted the ring around her finger, thinking about the woman who had worn it before her. She must have been small. She was, tiny little thing, but she could outwork any two men when she set her mind to it. She would have liked you, I think. "How can you be sure?" Jonah smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "Because she had a soft spot for strays and lost causes. Used to drive my father crazy the way she'd take in every hurt animal or struggling person who crossed our path." "Is that what I am?" Clara asked. "A lost cause?" "No," Jonah said firmly. "You're a survivor. There's a difference." After dinner, Jonah showed her to the downstairs bedroom. It was a small but comfortable space with a single bed covered in a beautiful quilt, a washstand, and a window that looked out into the forest. "I put some things in the dresser that might fit you," he said awkwardly. "Nothing fancy, but they're clean and warm." Clara opened the top drawer to find several simple dresses in soft cotton and wool, all in colors that would complement her fair skin and brown hair. They looked to be about her size, or at least close enough to work with some minor adjustments. "Where did these come from?" she asked. Jonah was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window into the darkness. "They belong to my wife," he said finally. "She's been gone 3 years now. I thought maybe it was time they were worn again." The simple words hit Clara like a thunderbolt. A wife. He'd had a wife, and she was gone. That explained the child-sized rocking chair, the swing, the flower boxes. It explained the sadness she'd seen in his eyes and the careful way he'd built this beautiful home. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know." "Her name was Sarah," Jonah continued as if he hadn't heard her. "We were married for 5 years. She died in childbirth along with our son." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, understanding now why he'd been so kind to her, why he'd been willing to take in a pregnant woman with nowhere else to go. "That's why you helped me," she said, "because of her." Jonah turned from the window to look at her. "Maybe partly, but mostly I helped you because it was the right thing to do, because you deserved better than what was happening to you." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Clara, the marriage vows we spoke tonight, I meant them. You're under my protection now, and I don't take that lightly. Whatever happens, you and your baby are safe here." After he left, Clara changed into one of Sarah's nightgowns and lay down on the comfortable bed. The quilt smelled faintly of lavender and sunshine, and she wondered about the woman who had slept here before her. What had Sarah been like? Had she been happy in this isolated place with her mountain man husband? Outside her window, the wind whispered through the pine trees, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate. For the first time in months, Clara felt truly safe, protected. She placed her hands on her belly and felt the baby moving, settling into sleep as she was. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears. Barrett Sloane wouldn't give up easily, and there would be consequences for what had happened today. But tonight she was Clara Briggs, wife of Jonah, protected by law and custom, and the promise of a good man. Tonight she was home. The last thing she remembered before sleep took her was the sound of Jonah moving quietly around the cabin, banking the fire and setting things to rights for the night. Even in her dreams, the sound of his presence nearby made her feel safe. Miles away in town, Barrett Sloane sat in his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand and murder in his heart. The pregnant girl was his by right, and no mountain hermit was going to take what belonged to him. He'd tried to do things the legal way, but if the law wouldn't help him, he'd find other methods. He had men who owed him favors, men who wouldn't ask questions if the price was right. The mountain man might think he'd won, but Barrett Sloane always got what he wanted in the end. Dawn came softly to the mountains, filtering through the pine boughs in shafts of golden light that danced across Clara's face. She woke slowly, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings, before the events of the previous day came flooding back. The marriage, the cabin, Jonah Briggs, who was now her husband in name, if nothing else. The baby was active this morning, stretching and turning as if testing the boundaries of its small world. Clara placed her hands on her belly and whispered a soft good morning, wondering if her child could sense the change in their circumstances. From the kitchen came the gentle sounds of someone moving quietly about, trying not to wake her. She dressed carefully in one of Sarah's dresses, a simple blue cotton that fit surprisingly well. The fabric was soft from years of washing, and she found herself wondering again about the woman who had worn it before her. In the mirror above the washstand, Clara caught a glimpse of herself and was startled by what she saw. For the first time in months, her face didn't look haunted. The constant tension around her eyes had eased, and there was color in her cheeks that had nothing to do with rouge. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Jonah at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and what appeared to be a ledger book spread before him. He looked up as she entered, and she caught a flicker of something surprise, perhaps, in his gray eyes. "Good morning," he said, rising from his chair with old-fashioned courtesy. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," Clara admitted, accepting the chair he pulled out for her. "Thank you." Jonah poured her a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove, adding milk without being asked. "I wasn't sure how you liked it," he said. "This is perfect." The coffee was strong and hot, exactly what she needed to chase away the last wisps of sleep. "What are you working on?" "Planning," Jonah said, settling back into his own chair. "Winter's coming fast up here, and there are preparations to make. Plus, with things being unsettled in town, we need to think about being more self-sufficient than usual." Clara studied his face, noting the lines of tension around his eyes that hadn't been there the night before. "You're worried about Sloane." "I'd be a fool not to be. Men like Barrett Sloane don't give up easy, especially when they've been humiliated in public. He'll be looking for ways to get back at us." "Us," Clara repeated softly. The word still felt strange on her tongue, this idea that she was part of an us again. "That's right," Jonah said firmly. "Us. You're my wife now, Clara, and that means we face whatever comes together." Before Clara could respond, Bear's sudden barking from outside made them both freeze. The dog's bark was sharp and urgent, nothing like his usual friendly greeting. "Someone's coming," Jonah said, already moving toward the rifle above the fireplace. "Stay inside." But Clara was already at the window, peering through the curtains toward the trail. "It's 2 men on horseback," she reported, her heart beginning to race. "One of them is wearing a badge." Jonah's jaw tightened. "Sheriff Grady, faster than I expected." He checked the rifle's load, then looked at Clara seriously. "Remember, you're my wife. We were married last night by Doc Mason. Don't let them rattle you." Clara nodded, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. The riders were close enough now that she could see their faces clearly. Sheriff Grady was a middle-aged man with a graying mustache and tired eyes. His companion was younger, harder-looking, with the kind of face that suggested he enjoyed other people's discomfort. "Jonah Briggs," Sheriff Grady called out as he dismounted. "Need to have a word with you." Jonah opened the door but didn't step outside, keeping the rifle visible but not directly threatening. "Morning, Sheriff. What brings you up the mountain so early?" "You know damn well what brings me here," Grady replied, though he sounded more weary than angry. "Got a complaint from Barrett Sloan about a girl you supposedly took from town yesterday." "No supposedly about it," Jonah said calmly. "I paid her father fair and square for her freedom, got witnesses to prove it. That's not how Sloan tells it. Says the whole thing was illegal, that you interfered with a legitimate business transaction." Clara took a deep breath and stepped into the doorway beside Jonah, both men's eyes immediately fixed on her, and she saw the younger man's gaze linger on her swollen belly with obvious interest. "Good morning, Sheriff," she said, proud that her voice remained steady. "I'm Mrs. Briggs." Sheriff Grady's eyebrows shot up. "Mrs. Briggs, since when?" "Since last night," Jonah replied. "Doc Mason performed the ceremony, all legal and proper." The younger man, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke up. "Convenient timing, wouldn't you say? Almost like you knew we were coming." "And you are." Jonah's tone was dangerously quiet. "Deputy Jake Wilson," the man replied with a smirk. "Mr. Sloan sent me along to make sure everything was handled proper." Clara felt ice form in her stomach. "Sloan sent you?" "That's right, ma'am. Mr. Sloan's got a legal interest in this matter, seeing as how he was the highest bidder for your services." "My services?" Clara's voice sharpened with anger. "I'm not a piece of property to be bought and sold." Now, Deputy Wilson said with false sympathy. "No need to get upset. We're just here to sort out this little misunderstanding." Sheriff Grady shot his deputy a warning look. "Wilson, keep your mouth shut." He turned back to Jonah and Clara. "Look, I don't like this any more than you do, but I've got to follow the law. Sloan's claiming the girl was sold to him, and your dollar doesn't change that." "Actually, it does," came a new voice from the trail. All heads turned to see Doc Mason riding up the path, his black bag secured behind his saddle and an official-looking document in his hand. "Good morning, Sheriff, gentlemen, Mrs. Briggs." "Doc," Sheriff Grady said with obvious relief. "Glad you're here. Maybe you can help sort this mess out." "Happy to," Doc Mason replied, dismounting with the stiffness of a man who'd spent too many hours in the saddle. "I've got the marriage certificate right here, all signed and sealed. Jonah Briggs and Clara May Hutchins were lawfully married last night at 8:30 p.m., with myself officiating." Deputy Wilson snatched the document from the doctor's hands, studying it with obvious frustration. "This doesn't change anything. Sloan still has a legal claim." "Actually, it changes everything," Doc Mason replied mildly. "Under territorial law, a married woman's legal status transfers to her husband. Any previous contracts or obligations become null and void." "That's the biggest load of," Wilson began, but Sheriff Grady cut him off. "Wilson, stand down." The sheriff studied the marriage certificate for himself, then handed it back to Doc Mason with a sigh. "Looks like everything's in order. Mrs. Briggs is legally married, which means she's under her husband's protection now." "Sloan's not going to like this," Wilson muttered. "Then Sloan can take it up with the territorial courts," Grady replied firmly. "My job is to enforce the law as it stands, not to make Barrett Sloan happy." Clara felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was short-lived. The expression on Deputy Wilson's face promised that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. "We'll be going then," Sheriff Grady said, tipping his hat to Clara. "Mrs. Briggs, Mr. Briggs, Doc, sorry to have troubled you." But as the two lawmen mounted their horses, Wilson turned back with a cold smile. "Enjoy your honeymoon, folks. Hope nothing unfortunate happens to disturb your domestic bliss." The threat in his words was unmistakable. Jonah stepped forward, his hand tightening on the rifle. "Was that supposed to scare me, deputy?" Wilson's smile widened. "Just making conversation, mountain man. Just making conversation." They rode away, leaving Clara, Jonah, and Doc Mason standing in the clearing. The silence stretched until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. "That deputy's trouble," Doc Mason said finally. "Wilson's been in Sloane's pocket since the day he pinned on that badge." "I know," Jonah replied grimly. "Question is, what's Sloane planning next?" "Nothing good," the doctor said. "You need to be careful, both of you. Sloane's not the type to accept defeat gracefully." Doc Mason stayed for breakfast, and during the meal, Clara learned more about the complex web of relationships that governed life in Silver Creek. Barrett Sloane owned not just the largest ranch in the territory, but also held mortgages on half the businesses in town. He'd been systematically buying up land and water rights for years, squeezing out smaller ranchers and farmers who couldn't compete with his resources. "The man's got political ambitions, too," Doc Mason explained over coffee. "Wants to be territorial governor when statehood comes. Having that kind of power would make him untouchable." "What about the other ranchers?" Clara asked. "Surely they don't all support him." "Some do, some don't. But the ones who oppose him have a way of running into trouble. Cattle, disappearing water rights, disputed, that sort of thing. Hard to prove, but the pattern's there if you know how to look." Jonah was quiet throughout this conversation, but Clara could see the wheels turning in his mind. Finally, he asked, "Doc, what do you know about Sloane's claim to water rights up here in the mountains?" The doctor's eyebrows rose. "Now that's an interesting question. Why do you ask? Because this land has been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather filed the original claim back in 1842, and we've got documentation to prove it. That includes water rights to Silver Creek itself, where it runs through our property." "You're kidding," Doc Mason breathed. "You mean to tell me you've got senior water rights to the creek that feeds half of Sloane's ranch?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you." Clara looked back and forth between the two men, not understanding the significance of what was being discussed. "What does that mean?" "It means," Doc Mason said slowly, "that if Jonah wanted to, he could legally divert Silver Creek away from Sloane's ranch, cut off his water supply completely." "I'd never do that," Jonah said quickly. "Too many innocent people would suffer, but the fact that I could do it changes the balance of power considerably," the doctor finished. "No wonder Sloane's so interested in getting control of you and your property. If he could force you out, or better yet, get you declared unfit to hold the land, he could claim the water rights for himself," Clara said, understanding dawning. "That's what this is really about, not me at all." "Oh, it's about you too," Jonah said grimly. "Sloane's the type who doesn't like being told no, especially by a woman. But you're right, the water rights make it bigger than just wounded pride." Doc Mason gathered up his things to leave, but before he mounted his horse, he pulled Jonah aside for a private conversation. Clara couldn't hear what they were saying, but she saw the doctor hand Jonah something small that disappeared quickly into his coat pocket. "What was that about?" she asked, after the doctor had ridden away. Jonah looked uncomfortable. "Doc thinks we should be prepared for trouble. He gave me something that might help if things get bad." "What kind of something?" "A small bottle of laudanum, in case," he gestured vaguely toward her belly, "in case the baby comes early, or if there are complications." Clara felt a chill run through her. The idea that her pregnancy might become a weapon to be used against them hadn't occurred to her, but she could see how it might. If something happened to her or the baby, Jonah could be blamed, his character called into question. "How much time do we have?" she asked quietly. "Doc thinks maybe 6 weeks based on what he can see. Could be sooner if stress brings on early labor." 6 weeks. Clara placed her hands on her belly, feeling the baby moving restlessly inside. 6 weeks to figure out how to protect themselves and this new life growing within her. The rest of the morning passed quietly, with Jonah showing Clara around the property and explaining the routines that kept the small homestead running. There were chickens to feed a cow, to milk firewood, to split and stack. Clara insisted on helping despite Jonah's protests, grateful for something practical to occupy her hands and mind. "Sarah's garden," Jonah said when they reached the plot of brown stalks and empty earth. "She had quite a way with vegetables, fed us through most of the winter just from what she grew here." Clara knelt carefully and picked up a handful of the rich, dark soil. "Could I try growing something in the spring? I mean, if we're still here, this is your home now, Clara. Of course you can plant whatever you want." The word home sent a warm flutter through her chest. When was the last time she'd had a place that felt like home, not just a roof over her head, but a place where she belonged, where she was wanted? They were walking back toward the cabin when Bear suddenly went rigid. His ears pricked toward the forest. A low growl rumbled in his throat, and both humans immediately went on alert. "What is it, boy?" Jonah murmured, his hand moving instinctively to the pistol at his hip. The forest seemed to hold its breath. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Even the wind had died to stillness. Then Clara saw it, a flash of movement among the trees, too quick and deliberate to be an animal. Someone was watching them. "Jonah," she whispered. "I see it. Get to the cabin, now." They moved quickly but calmly toward the house, not wanting to appear panicked but understanding the need for shelter. Bear flanked them, his hackles raised and his eyes fixed on the tree line. They'd almost reached the porch when the shot rang out. The bullet splintered the wood of the cabin wall not 3 inches from Clara's head. She screamed and stumbled, her hands instinctively protecting her belly. Jonah caught her before she could fall, pulling her behind the cover of the porch while simultaneously drawing his pistol. "Inside!" he shouted. "Get inside!" More shots erupted from the forest, at least 3 different weapons by the sound of it. Glass shattered as bullets found the cabin windows. Bear began barking furiously, torn between protecting his humans and charging toward the attackers. Jonah kicked open the front door and practically carried Clara inside, both of them staying low as more bullets whined overhead. Once they were behind the thick log walls, Jonah grabbed his rifle from above the fireplace and began checking his ammunition. "How many do you think?" Clara gasped, her heart hammering so hard she could barely speak. "At least 3, maybe more. They've got us surrounded." Another volley of shots peppered the cabin, some finding their mark in the heavy logs, others sailing harmlessly overhead. Whoever was out there, they were good shots, but not great ones. They were trying to pin down their targets rather than kill them outright. "Mrs. Briggs," a voice called from the forest. Clara recognized it immediately. "Deputy Wilson. You and your husband need to come out and talk." "Go to hell," Jonah shouted back, positioning himself at a window where he could see part of the tree line. "Now that's not very neighborly." Wilson's voice carried a mocking tone. "All we want is to have a civilized conversation about resolving this situation. With guns," Clara called out, surprising herself with her own boldness. "Sometimes folks need a little encouragement to see reason," Wilson replied. "Mr. Sloane's prepared to be generous. He's willing to forget this whole misunderstanding if Mrs. Briggs comes back to town where she belongs." "Over my dead body," Jonah snarled. "That can be arranged," came a different voice from the opposite side of the cabin. They definitely had the place surrounded. Clara tried to think clearly despite the terror coursing through her veins. "What do they really want?" she asked Jonah. "If they wanted us dead, they could have just shot us in the garden." Jonah considered this, his eyes never leaving the window. "You're right, they want something else. Maybe to make it look like we started trouble, gave them an excuse to use force. Or maybe they want to take me alive," Clara said quietly. "Can't claim Sloane's property rights if the property is damaged." The casual way she referred to herself as property made Jonah's jaw clench, but he couldn't argue with her logic. "Mrs. Briggs," Wilson called again, You've got 5 minutes to think it over. After that, we start getting impatient." Clara looked around the cabin, this place that had briefly felt like home. The beautiful furniture, the well-stocked shelves, the signs of love and care that had gone into building this life. In a few hours, it could all be reduced to ashes. "There has to be another way," she murmured. "There is," Jonah said grimly, "but you're not going to like it. Tell me." Jonah moved away from the window and knelt beside her, his storm-gray eyes intense with purpose. "There's a root cellar under the kitchen floor. Hidden entrance leads to a tunnel that comes out about 50 yards away near the stream. Sarah and I dug it during our first winter here in case of Indian trouble. You want me to hide while you fight them alone? I want you to get away while I keep them busy. Follow the stream down to the main trail, then head for town. Find Doc Mason or Reverend Wickham, someone you can trust." Clara stared at him in disbelief. "I'm not leaving you to face this alone. We're married, remember? That means we face things together." "Clara, be reasonable. You're pregnant. You can't fight." "I can shoot," she interrupted. "My father taught me when I was 12. I'm not helpless, Jonah." Before he could argue further, another voice joined the conversation, outside this one older, more authoritative. Clara's blood ran cold as she recognized it. Jonah Briggs, Barrett Sloane himself, had arrived. "I'm offering you one last chance to end this peacefully. Send out my property, and we'll call it even." "Your property," Jonah roared back. "She's my wife, you bastard." "A marriage of convenience isn't a real marriage," Sloane replied. "Everyone knows you barely met her yesterday. You think that piece of paper means anything?" The words stung because they held a grain of truth. Clara and Jonah barely knew each other, and their marriage was indeed one of convenience. But as she looked at this man who had risked everything to protect her, who was willing to face down armed men rather than give her up, she realized that paper meant more than Barrett Sloane could possibly understand. "Time's up." Wilson's voice carried a note of anticipation. "Hope you said your prayers, Clara," Jonah said urgently. "Please, go to the cellar. I can't protect you if I'm worrying about you getting shot." Clara looked into his eyes and saw not just concern for her safety, but something deeper. Fear. Real gut-deep fear that something would happen to her and the baby. In that moment, she understood that this wasn't just about duty or honor for him. Somehow, in the space of 24 hours, she had become important to him as a person, not just as a responsibility. "All right," she said quietly. "But if you get yourself killed, Jonah Briggs, I'll never forgive you." Despite everything, he smiled. "Fair enough. Now go." He led her quickly to the kitchen, where he pulled aside a braided rug to reveal a hidden trapdoor in the floor. The space below was dark and cramped, but she could see the mouth of a tunnel leading away from the cabin. "Follow it all the way to the end," Jonah instructed. "Don't come back no matter what you hear. Promise me." "I promise," Clara lied, knowing even as she said it that she had no intention of abandoning him. He helped her down into the cellar, their faces level for a moment as she stood on the rough wooden ladder. On impulse, she reached up and kissed him, not the chaste peck they'd shared at their wedding, but a real kiss full of fear and gratitude, and something that might have been the beginning of love. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Be careful," she whispered. "You too," he replied, then closed the trapdoor above her head. Clara made her way through the tunnel, feeling her way along the rough-hewn walls in the darkness. The baby was active now, responding to her elevated heart rate and the stress hormones flooding her system. She tried to send calming thoughts to the small life within her, but it was hard to be calm when the sound of gunfire was echoing through the earth above her head. The tunnel ended at a concealed opening near the stream, just as Jonah had said. Clara emerged into the late afternoon sunlight, immediately alert for any sign of Sloane's men. The forest seemed empty, but she knew that was probably an illusion. Following the stream would take her away from the cabin and toward the main trail, but it would also take her away from Jonah. She crouched behind a fallen log, torn between the promise she'd made and the growing certainty that he needed help. The gunfire from the cabin was sporadic now, suggesting that the attackers were being cautious. Jonah was an excellent shot, and the cabin was built like a fortress. He could probably hold them off for hours if he had enough ammunition, but what if he didn't? What if they set fire to the cabin or found another way to flush him out? Clara's hands went to her belly, feeling the baby moving restlessly. What kind of mother would she be if she let her child's protector die without even trying to help? What kind of wife would she be if she abandoned her husband in his hour of need? The decision made itself. Instead of following the stream toward town, Clara began making her way carefully through the forest toward the back of the cabin. She had no weapon except a small knife from the kitchen that she'd grabbed on impulse, but maybe she could create a distraction, draw some of the attackers away from Jonah. As she crept closer to the cabin, she could see muzzle flashes from at least 4 different positions. Sloane's men had the place well surrounded, but they were concentrating their fire on the front and sides of the building. The back was less heavily watched. Clara had grown up in these mountains, and she knew how to move quietly through the forest. Her father had taken her hunting many times before drink, and bitterness had poisoned him, and those lessons served her well now. She worked her way to within 30 yards of the cabin's back wall, close enough to see Deputy Wilson crouched behind a tree, his rifle trained on one of the windows. The baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly strong kick, and Clara bit back a gasp of pain. The movement was getting stronger, more frequent. Was this normal, or was stress bringing on early labor? She couldn't think about that now. Jonah needed help, and she was the only one who could provide it. Taking a deep breath, Clara picked up a large rock and hurled it as hard as she could toward a tree about 20 feet to Wilson's left. The sound of the impact was loud enough to draw his attention, and he immediately swung his rifle toward the noise. That gave Clara the opening she needed. Moving as quickly and quietly as she could, she closed the distance between them. Wilson was so focused on the direction of the sound that he never saw her coming. The kitchen knife slid between his ribs with surprising ease, and Wilson dropped his rifle with a strangled cry. Clara had never stabbed anyone before, and the reality of it, the resistance of flesh and bone, the hot wetness of blood on her hands, made her stomach lurch. But there was no time for squeamishness. Wilson was wounded but not dead, and he was already reaching for the pistol at his hip. "Don't," Clara said quietly, pressing the bloody knife to his throat. "Don't even think about it." Wilson's eyes were wide with shock and pain, but also with calculation. He was trying to figure out if she had the nerve to finish what she'd started. "You crazy bitch," he gasped. "You stabbed me, and I'll do it again if you don't shut up and listen," Clara hissed. "Call off your men. End this now." "Go to hell," Wilson snarled, then called out loudly. "She's here. The woman's here behind the—" Clara's knife cut off his words permanently. She'd never killed anyone before, but the act itself was surprisingly simple. One quick motion, and Wilson's eyes went blank. The shouts from his position had alerted the other attackers, though, and Clara could hear them crashing through the underbrush toward her location. She grabbed Wilson's rifle and pistol, then began working her way around to the side of the cabin where she could signal Jonah. "Jonah," she called out. "It's Clara, don't shoot." A window opened slightly, and she could see his rifle barrel tracking toward the sound of approaching men. "I thought I told you to get to town," he shouted back. "Wilson's dead, but there are still at least 3 more. Jonah's rifle spoke, and somewhere in the forest a man screamed, "Get inside back door." Clara ran for the cabin as bullets began flying around her. One tugged at her skirt, another splintered the doorframe inches from her head, but she made it inside, and Jonah immediately barred the door behind her. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, running his hands over her arms and shoulders, checking for wounds. "I'm fine," Clara gasped. "But Jonah, the baby, something's wrong. The pains are getting stronger." Jonah's face went pale. "How strong? How often?" "Every few minutes now. And they're not just kicks anymore, they're real contractions." The irony of the situation was almost laughable. Here they were surrounded by men trying to kill them, and Clara was going into labor. "We need to get you to Doc Mason," Jonah said desperately. "We need to survive the next hour first." Clara replied, taking Wilson's pistol and checking the load. "How much ammunition do you have left?" "Enough for maybe 20 more shots. You—" Clara counted quickly. 15 in the rifle, 6 in the pistol. Another contraction hit her, then stronger than the others, and she had to grab the wall for support. When it passed, she looked up to find Jonah watching her with an expression of helpless concern. "This is my fault," he said quietly. "If I hadn't brought you here—" "Stop it!" Clara interrupted firmly. "You saved my life, Jonah, both our lives. Whatever happens now, you gave us a chance." Outside, Barrett Sloane's voice rose above the sound of gunfire. "Briggs, I know you can hear me. Last chance to end this. Send out the girl and I'll let you live." "Never," Jonah shouted back, then turned to Clara. "Can you handle a rifle in your condition?" Another contraction was building, but Clara gritted her teeth and nodded. "Just tell me where to aim." As if in response to her words, they heard the sound of breaking glass from the front room. Someone had thrown something through one of the windows, probably a burning torch, judging by the smell of smoke that immediately began to fill the cabin. "They're trying to burn us out," Jonah said grimly. Clara looked around the cabin, this place that had briefly been her home, and felt something fierce and protective rise up inside her. These men had no right to destroy what Jonah and Sarah had built here. They had no right to take away the first safe place she'd known in months, and they certainly had no right to threaten her unborn child. "Let them try," she said, raising Wilson's rifle to her shoulder. "This is our home now, and I'll be damned if I let Barrett Sloane take it away from us." The words surprised her with their vehemence, but she meant every one. Somewhere in the space of 2 days, she had stopped being Clara Hutchins, the unwanted daughter and discarded woman. She had become Clara Briggs, wife and mother and defender of her own small piece of the world. The smoke was getting thicker now, and through the growing haze, Clara could see shadows moving outside the windows. Sloane's men were getting ready to rush the cabin, probably figuring that the fire would drive the occupants outside where they could be easily captured. They were about to learn that Clara Briggs was full of surprises. "Ready?" Jonah asked, his rifle trained on the front door. Clara felt another contraction building, but she pushed the pain aside and focused on the window where she could see a man's silhouette moving closer. "Ready," she said. And then the real battle began. The first man through the front door never knew what hit him. Clara's rifle spoke with deadly accuracy, and he crumpled to the floor before he could raise his own weapon. Behind him, another attacker dove for cover behind the overturned table, but Jonah's shot found him anyway, the heavy slug punching through the wooden barrier like it was paper. Smoke was filling the cabin now, thick and acrid, making it hard to see and harder to breathe. Clara felt another contraction building and had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. The pain was getting stronger, more insistent, and she knew with growing certainty that her baby was coming, whether this battle was over or not. "The kitchen!" Jonah shouted over the gunfire. "They're coming through the kitchen!" Clara spun toward the sound of splintering wood, her rifle already moving to track the new threat. 2 men burst through the back door, their faces masked with bandanas against the smoke. She fired once, twice, and one of them spun away with a scream. The other dove behind the kitchen table, but he was trapped now, caught between Clara's position and Jonah's rifle. "Give it up," the man called out desperately. "You can't win this, there's more of us coming." "Then they can join you in hell," Jonah replied, his shot splintering the edge of the table where the man was hiding. Outside, Clara could hear Barrett Sloane shouting orders, his voice raw with frustration and rage. "Burn them out. I don't care what it takes. I want that woman." The smoke was getting thicker, and Clara realized with growing alarm that the fire was spreading faster than she'd expected. Orange flames were already licking at the ceiling in the front room, and the heat was becoming oppressive. "Jonah," she gasped, another contraction doubling her over. "The fire, we have to get out of here." "I know," he replied grimly, but his attention was focused on movement outside the side window. but they've got the place surrounded. The moment we step outside—" His words were cut off by the sound of hoofbeats thundering up the trail, lots of them coming fast. Clara's heart sank, thinking that Sloane had brought reinforcements, but then she heard a voice that made her pulse quicken with hope. "This is Sheriff Grady. Drop your weapons and surrender." Through the smoke-hazed window, Clara could see at least a dozen riders spreading out around the cabin. Real lawmen this time, not Sloane's bought deputies. "About damn time," Jonah muttered, then called out loudly, "Sheriff, it's Jonah Briggs. Sloane's men set fire to my cabin." "I can see that." Grady's voice was sharp with anger. "Sloane, what the hell is going on here?" Clara couldn't hear Sloane's response over the crackling of flames and her own labored breathing, but she could imagine the smooth lies he was spinning. The man who had tried to buy her like livestock wouldn't hesitate to claim he was the victim here. Another contraction hit stronger than any before, and this time Clara couldn't suppress the cry of pain that escaped her lips. The baby was coming, and it was coming now. "Clara!" Jonah was at her side instantly, his rifle temporarily forgotten. "How bad is it?" "Bad," she gasped. "Jonah, I can't. The baby's coming, right now." The irony of the situation would have been funny if it weren't so terrifying. After all they'd been through, all the violence and fear and desperate fighting, Clara was about to give birth in a burning cabin while gunmen waited outside. "Sheriff Grady," Jonah shouted, "my wife's in labor. I need to get her out of here." "Nobody moves until I sort this out," came the reply. "Sloane, call off your men." "They're not my men." Sloane's voice carried even through the chaos. "I came here to retrieve my property, and these mountain folk started shooting." "Your property," Sheriff Grady's voice rose dangerously. "Are you talking about people as property, Barrett?" Clara felt a surge of gratitude toward the sheriff. Whatever else happened, at least one lawman was asking the right questions. The fire was spreading rapidly now, and the heat was becoming unbearable. Smoke was pouring through every crack and crevice, and Clara could barely breathe between contractions. "We have to go," Jonah said urgently. "Fire or no fire, gunmen or no gunmen, we can't stay here." He helped Clara to her feet, supporting most of her weight as another wave of pain swept through her. The baby was definitely coming, and soon. She could feel the pressure building, the inexorable force of new life, demanding to be born. "The front door," she gasped. "Closest to the sheriff." Jonah nodded, then called out again. "Sheriff, we're coming out the front. Don't let anyone shoot." "Nobody shoots," Grady commanded, his voice carrying the full authority of his office. "Anyone who fires a weapon will answer to me personally." Jonah kicked open the front door, and they stumbled out into the blessed fresh air. Clara immediately collapsed to her knees as another contraction hit, this one so powerful it took her breath away. "Doc Mason!" Sheriff Grady was shouting. "Where's Doc Mason?" "Here," came a familiar voice, and Clara looked up through tears of pain and relief to see the elderly doctor dismounting from his horse with his medical bag already in hand. "What's the situation?" "Woman in labor," Grady replied tersely, "and somebody better start explaining why my deputy is dead in the woods with a knife in his back." Clara's blood chilled. In all the chaos, she'd forgotten about Wilson. Now she would have to explain why she'd killed a lawman, even a corrupt one. "Clara killed him," Jonah said simply, his hand protective on her shoulder. "In self-defense. Wilson was part of Sloane's attack on our home." "That's a lie." Barrett Sloane pushed forward through the crowd of lawmen, his face red with rage and soot. "That woman is a murderer. She killed my deputy in cold blood." "Your deputy," Sheriff Grady's voice was dangerously quiet. "Since when do you give orders to my men, Barrett?" For the first time, Sloane seemed to realize he'd revealed too much. His face went pale, but he pressed on. "Wilson was helping me retrieve stolen property. That woman belongs to me." "No one belongs to you," Doc Mason said firmly, kneeling beside Clara and opening his medical bag. "This is Mrs. Jonah Briggs, legally married and under her husband's protection." Another contraction hit, and Clara couldn't help the scream that tore from her throat. The baby was coming whether she was ready or not, and there was nowhere private to go, nowhere safe to deliver this child, who was already proving to have the worst timing in history. "We need to get her inside somewhere," Doc Mason said urgently. "She can't have this baby out here in the open." "The barn," Jonah suggested. "It's far enough from the fire." "No." The voice was soft but firm, and everyone turned to see a woman stepping forward from among the riders. Clara had never seen her before, but she was clearly someone of importance, well-dressed, confident, with the kind of bearing that suggested she was used to being obeyed. "I'm Margaret Whitfield," the woman said, "the mayor's wife. We'll take her to my house in town. It's only 20 minutes if we hurry." "She doesn't have 20 minutes, Doc Mason replied grimly. "This baby's coming now." As if to prove his point, Clara felt something give way inside her, and suddenly there was warm fluid soaking her dress. Her water had broken. "Oh, God," she gasped. "It's really happening." Margaret Whitfield took charge with the efficiency of a woman who had raised 6 children of her own. "Sheriff, clear those men away from the barn. Doc, you and Mr. Briggs get her inside. I'll need clean water towels and someone to keep that fire from spreading." Clara barely remembered the next few minutes. Strong hands lifted her, carried her into the dim coolness of the barn. Clean straw was spread on the floor, and someone Margaret she thought was speaking to her in low, soothing tones about breathing and pushing and letting her body do what it needed to do. Through it all, Jonah never left her side. His hand gripped hers with steady strength, and his voice was a constant presence in the chaos of pain and effort. "You can do this, Clara," he murmured. "You're the strongest woman I've ever met. You can do anything." Outside the barn, Clara could hear angry voices as Sheriff Grady questioned Barrett Sloan and his remaining men. The fire had been contained, but damage to the cabin was extensive. Everything she and Jonah had shared for 2 brief days was going up in smoke. But somehow that didn't seem to matter as much as it should have. What mattered was the life struggling to be born, the man holding her hand, and the community of people who had rallied to help a woman they barely knew. "I can see the head," Doc Mason announced. "One more push, Clara, just one more good push." Clara bore down with every ounce of strength she had left, and suddenly the pressure was gone. A thin, angry wail filled the barn, and she looked down to see Doc Mason holding a tiny, perfect baby. "It's a boy," he said with a grin, "a beautiful, healthy boy." Clara burst into tears, overwhelmed by relief and joy and exhaustion. Jonah was crying too. She realized tears streaming down his soot-stained face as he stared at the small life they had brought into the world together. "He's perfect," Jonah whispered on. "Absolutely perfect." Doc Mason cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a soft blanket that Margaret Whitfield had produced from somewhere. Then he placed the tiny bundle in Clara's arms, and she felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known were possible. "Hello, little one," she murmured. "I'm your mama." The baby opened his eyes, gray eyes she noticed like storm clouds, like his father's, and seemed to focus on her face with solemn attention. "What will you name him?" Margaret asked softly. Clara looked at Jonah, this man who had risked everything to protect them, who had given them both his name and his love without asking for anything in return. "Samuel," she said. "Samuel Briggs, after Jonah's father." Jonah's face crumpled with emotion. "Clara, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," she interrupted gently. "He's your son now, Jonah, in every way that matters." Outside the barn, the voices were getting louder and more heated. Sheriff Grady was clearly reaching the end of his patience with Barrett Sloan's explanations. "Let me get this straight," they could hear him saying. "You brought armed men to attack a family in their own home because you thought you had some claim to a married woman. She wasn't married when I made the deal with her father," Sloan protested. "The whole thing was a sham designed to cheat me out of what was rightfully mine. Nothing about that woman was ever rightfully yours," came another voice, Reverend Wickham. Clara realized. "What you attempted here today was an abomination in the eyes of God and man." "Stay out of this, preacher," Sloan snarled. "This is a business matter. Human beings are not business," the Reverend shot back. "And if you think the good people of this community will stand by while you treat them as such, you're sadly mistaken." A murmur of agreement rose from the assembled crowd, and Clara realized that more people had arrived while she was giving birth. Through the barn door, she could see dozens of faces, townspeople, ranchers, farmers, all drawn by the smoke and commotion. "He's right," called out a voice Clara recognized as Jake Morrison from the livery stable. "I was there yesterday, Sloan. I saw what you tried to do, bidding on that poor girl like she was livestock." "We all saw it," added another voice, "and we all saw how Briggs treated her with respect when you would have treated her like property." Barrett Sloan's voice rose to a shout. "That woman owes me. Her father took my money. You never gave Tom Hutchins a cent." Sheriff Grady's voice cut through the noise like a whip. "I've been asking around Barrett, and you know what I found Tom's debts are, all to you. Have been for months. You've been squeezing him, waiting for him to break, planning to take that girl all along." The barn fell silent except for little Samuel's soft breathing and the distant crackle of dying flames. Clara felt cold despite the warmth of the baby in her arms. "Is that true?" she whispered. Jonah's face was grim. It would make sense. Sloan's been buying up land and businesses all over the territory. Wouldn't be the first time he'd engineered someone's financial ruin to get what he wanted. "But what did he want with me?" Clara asked, though she was beginning to suspect she knew the answer. "You and through you, this land," Jonah replied. "With senior water rights to Silver Creek, this property is worth a fortune to someone like Sloan. If he could get control of you, he could probably force a sale or find some other way to claim the land. And if I'd gone with him yesterday," Jonah's jaw tightened, "you'd have disappeared. Maybe an accident, maybe just vanished into the mountains. Either way, your claim to be my wife would have died with you, and Sloan could have moved against the property without interference." The cold realization of how close she'd come to such a fate made Clara hold Samuel even tighter. This beautiful, innocent life might never have existed if Barrett Sloan had gotten his way. Outside, Sheriff Grady was still questioning Sloan, and his tone was getting increasingly hostile. "So let me understand this completely," the sheriff said. "You manipulated Tom Hutchins into debt, then arranged for his daughter to be auctioned off to you. When that plan failed, you sent armed men to attack the Briggs homestead and kidnap Mrs. Briggs. Does that about sum it up?" "You can't prove any of that," Sloan blustered, but there was fear in his voice now. "Actually, I can," came a new voice from the crowd. Clara couldn't see who was speaking, but the voice was young and nervous. "I can prove all of it." "Who's that?" Sloan demanded. "Name's Billy Carter," the voice replied, growing stronger. "I work for you, Mr. Sloan, or I did until today. I was there when you planned this whole thing. I heard you talking to Wilson about how you were going to get rid of the mountain man and take his land." "You're lying." Sloan's voice was shrill with panic now. "I never said any such thing." "You said a lot more than that," Billy Carter continued. "You said once you had control of the creek, you could squeeze out every small rancher in the valley. You said you'd own this whole territory before you were done." An angry murmur rose from the crowd. Many of the people gathered were exactly the small ranchers and farmers that Sloan had apparently planned to destroy. "That boy's a liar and a drunk," Sloan protested desperately. "You can't believe a word he says." "Maybe not," Sheriff Grady replied, "but I can believe the evidence, like the fact that 3 of the men who attacked this cabin are carrying weapons that belong to you, like the fact that Wilson was taking orders from you instead of from me, like the fact that you just admitted you think you have some claim to Mrs. Briggs." Clara heard the distinctive sound of handcuffs clicking into place. "Barrett Sloan," Sheriff Grady announced formally, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, attempted kidnapping, arson, and accessory to murder. You have the right to remain silent, though I doubt you'll use it." The cheer that went up from the crowd was so loud, It startled little Samuel, who let out an indignant wail. Clara soothed him gently, rocking him back and forth while tears of relief streamed down her face. "It's over," Jonah said wonderingly. "It's really over." But even as he spoke, Doc Mason was looking concerned. "I hate to interrupt the celebration," he said quietly, "but we need to get Clara and the baby somewhere warm and clean. She's lost some blood, and this little one needs to be properly examined." Margaret Whitfield stepped forward immediately. "They'll come home with me," she announced. "Both of them. I've got plenty of room, and my Sarah was just their age when she had her first baby. I know exactly what they need." "Mrs. Whitfield, that's very kind, but—" Clara began. "Nonsense," the older woman interrupted firmly. "You saved this community today, child. Both of you did. It's the least we can do to take care of you while you recover." Clara looked at Jonah, seeing her own uncertainty reflected in his eyes. The cabin was damaged, possibly beyond immediate repair. They had nowhere else to go, and winter was coming fast to the mountains. "What about Bear?" Jonah asked. "And the animals? Jake Morrison's already offered to look after them," Margaret replied. "The whole community's rallying around you, Mr. Briggs. You've got more friends than you know." As if to prove her point, Jake Morrison himself appeared in the barn doorway. "Jonah," he said earnestly, "I owe you an apology. We all do. We should have stood up to Sloan years ago, should have stopped him from hurting folks. But when we saw what you did yesterday, how you protected Clara when the rest of us just stood by—" He trailed off, clearly struggling with emotion. "You showed us what real courage looks like," he continued. "What it means to do the right thing no matter the cost. We won't forget that." Other voices joined in, people pushing into the barn to offer help. Congratulations and apologies. Clara found herself overwhelmed by the outpouring of support from people who had been strangers just days before. "Thank you," she managed to say. "All of you. I never expected—" "This is what community means," Reverend Wickham said, gently appearing at her side. "We take care of our own, and you, Mrs. Briggs, are definitely one of our own now." As the crowd began to disperse and arrangements were made for the move to the Whitfield house, Clara found herself alone with Jonah for a few precious moments. Samuel was sleeping peacefully in her arms, his tiny face serene despite all the chaos surrounding his birth. "Are you all right?" Jonah asked softly. "Really all right?" Clara considered the question seriously. She was exhausted, sore, and homeless. Her body ached from childbirth, and her heart ached for the cabin they'd lost. But she was alive, free, and holding her healthy son while the man she'd grown to love watched over them both. "I'm better than all right," she said finally. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Jonah leaned down and kissed her forehead, then gently touched Samuel's tiny hand. The baby's fingers instinctively curled around his father's finger, holding on tight. "He knows you," Clara murmured. "He knows his daddy." "I'll never let anything happen to either of you," Jonah promised. "Never again." Clara believed him. This man who had bought her freedom with a silver dollar, who had married her to protect her, who had fought armed men to defend their home, she trusted him with her life and her son's life. But more than that, she loved him. Somewhere in the chaos of the past 2 days, what had started as gratitude and convenience had become something real and deep and lasting. "Jonah," she said quietly. "Yes, when you asked me to marry you, you said it would be a marriage of convenience, that we'd figure things out as we went." "I remember." Clara looked down at Samuel, then back up at Jonah's storm-gray eyes. "I've figured something out." "What's that?" "I love you," she said simply. "Not because you saved me, not because you gave me your name or your protection. I love you because of who you are, because of the man who built a swing for a child, who never got to use it, who keeps his dead wife's dresses because he can't bear to throw away her memory, who saw a pregnant woman being sold like livestock and decided to do something about it." Jonah's eyes filled with tears. "Clara, I know you loved Sarah," she continued, I'm not asking you to forget her or replace her. I'm just asking you to let me love you too, to let us be a real family." For a long moment, Jonah couldn't speak. When he finally found his voice, it was rough with emotion. "I thought I'd lost the capacity to love anyone again," he said. "After Sarah and the baby died, I was sure my heart was broken beyond repair. But then you came along and you were so brave, so strong, so determined to protect your child, no matter what it cost you. And I realized that maybe broken hearts can heal if you give them something worth healing for." He reached out and cupped her face in his calloused hand. "I love you too, Clara Briggs. I love you, and I love Samuel, and I want nothing more than to spend the rest of my life making you both happy." This time, when he kissed her, it wasn't the chaste peck of their wedding or the desperate kiss in the tunnel. It was the kiss of a man claiming his wife, gentle but passionate, full of promise and hope and the beginning of something beautiful. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "So what now?" Clara asked. "Now we go to town and recover," Jonah replied. "And then we rebuild. The cabin can be repaired, maybe even improved. The land is still ours. The water rights are still ours. We'll make it better than it was before. And Sloan will spend the rest of his life in prison if Sheriff Grady has anything to say about it. Either way, he'll never threaten us again." Doc Mason appeared in the barn doorway, clearing his throat politely. "I hate to interrupt, but we really should get Clara and the baby to town before dark. It's been a long day, and they both need rest." Clara nodded reluctantly, allowing Margaret Whitfield to help her to her feet. Samuel stirred but didn't wake secure in his mother's arms. As they prepared to leave, Clara took one last look at the damaged cabin, at the place where her new life had truly begun. The walls were blackened with smoke and several windows were broken, but the structure was sound. With time and effort, it could be restored. "Don't look so sad," Jonah said gently. "It's just a building. Home isn't a place, it's the people you're with." Clara smiled, understanding the truth of his words. Home wasn't the cabin or the mountains or even the beautiful valley where they'd found each other. Home was this feeling of safety and love and belonging. Home was the family they'd created together in the space of 2 extraordinary days. "You're right," she said. "Let's go home." And as the unlikely procession made its way down the mountain, the new mother and her baby, the mountain man who'd become a husband and father, the townspeople who'd finally found their courage, Clara felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She'd lost everything and gained everything. She'd been sold like property and found like treasure. She'd married a stranger and discovered her soulmate. Most importantly, she'd learned that sometimes the worst moments of your life can lead to the best ones, and that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to do the right thing despite the fear. As little Samuel slept peacefully in her arms, and Jonah walked protectively beside them, Clara looked up at the stars, beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and whispered a prayer of gratitude for silver dollars and mountain men and the mysterious ways that broken people could heal each other. The future stretched ahead of them, full of challenges and joys, sorrows and triumphs. But whatever came, they would face it together, husband and wife, father and mother, family, bound not just by law but by love. And in the distance, barely visible through the gathering dusk, the lights of Silver Creek twinkled like earthbound stars, welcoming them home. The Whitfield house was a revelation of warmth and comfort that Clara had never experienced before. Margaret led them into a spacious guest room with flowered wallpaper, a large brass bed covered in soft quilts, and a cradle that had obviously been hastily prepared for Samuel. Lamplight cast golden shadows on the walls, and a fire crackled cheerfully in the small fireplace. "This was my daughter Sarah's room when she was small," Margaret explained, her voice gentle as she helped Clara settle into the comfortable chair beside the cradle. "She's married now, living in Denver, but I've kept it ready for grandchildren who don't visit often enough." Clara looked around the room, taking in the carefully preserved toys on the shelves, the delicate lace curtains, the small rocking horse in the corner. "It's beautiful. I can't thank you enough for—" "Nonsense," Margaret interrupted with a wave of her hand. You just focus on resting and taking care of that precious baby. Everything else can wait." Doc Mason bustled around the room, checking on both Clara and Samuel with professional efficiency. The baby was pronounced perfect in every way, while Clara was declared tired but healthy, with instructions to rest completely for at least a week. "No lifting anything heavier than the baby," he warned sternly. "No housework, no cooking, nothing but feeding Samuel and sleeping. Margaret will see to everything else." "But I can't just lie around while—" Clara began. "You can and you will," Jonah said firmly from his position by the window, where he'd been keeping watch on the street below. "After everything you've been through, you need time to recover." "Listen to your husband," Margaret added with a smile. "Men don't often give sensible advice, but when they do, it's worth taking." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Samuel began to fuss softly. Clara lifted him from the cradle, and he immediately settled against her chest, his tiny fist curling around a strand of her hair. "He knows his mama," Doc Mason observed with satisfaction. "Strong, healthy baby. You've done well, Clara." A soft knock at the door interrupted them, and Margaret went to answer it. "Oh, Reverend Wickham, come in, please." The minister entered carrying a small wooden box, his face beaming with quiet joy. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I wanted to bring something for the baby." He opened the box to reveal a beautiful silver christening cup, engraved with delicate vines and flowers. "This belonged to my own son," he explained. "He's grown now with children of his own, but I thought little Samuel might like to have it." Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected kindness. "Reverend, this is too generous. We can't accept—" "Of course you can," he said gently. "This community failed you yesterday, Clara. We stood by and watched while you were treated shamefully, and we're ashamed of that. Let us make amends in whatever small ways we can." More visitors arrived as the evening wore on. Jake Morrison brought a wooden toy horse he'd carved himself. Mrs. Patterson from the millinery shop arrived with a basket of baby clothes she'd sewn in various sizes. Even old Judge Morrison, who had seemed so intimidating at the auction, came to offer his apologies and a small leather-bound Bible for Samuel. "I should have stopped what was happening in the square," he said quietly to Clara. "I let my own debts to Sloane cloud my judgment, and I'm deeply sorry for that." "You're here now," Clara replied simply. "That's what matters." As the visitors finally began to depart, leaving the little family alone for the first time since Samuel's birth, Clara found herself overwhelmed by the day's events. Less than 24 hours ago, she'd been a frightened, pregnant woman married to a stranger. Now she was a mother surrounded by a community that had embraced her as one of their own. "Penny, for your thoughts," Jonah said softly, settling into the chair beside her bed. Clara shifted Samuel to her other arm, marveling at how perfectly he fit against her. "I'm thinking about how strange life is. 2 days ago I thought my story was ending. Now it feels like it's just beginning." "What kind of story do you think it will be?" Jonah asked, his gray eyes gentle in the lamplight. "A love story," Clara said without hesitation. "The kind where two broken people find each other and discover they can make something beautiful together." Jonah reached over and took her free hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "I like that story. How does it end?" "It doesn't," Clara replied with a smile. "The best love stories never really end. They just keep getting better." Before Jonah could respond, there was another knock at the door. Margaret's voice could be heard in the hallway, followed by a deeper, more authoritative tone that made Clara's blood run cold. "That sounds like Sheriff Grady," Jonah said, his hand instinctively moving to the gun at his hip. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her face grave. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but the sheriff needs to speak with you both. It's about Barrett Sloane." Sheriff Grady entered the room, his hat in his hands and his expression serious. "Folks, I'm afraid I have some news about Sloane's situation." Clara felt her heart begin to race. "What kind of news?" Well, the good news is that we've got enough evidence to charge him with conspiracy, attempted kidnapping, and a dozen other crimes. Billy Carter's testimony alone would be enough to put him away for years. And the bad news? Jonah asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected what was coming. Sloane's lawyer arrived from the territorial capital this afternoon. High-powered attorney with connections all the way to Washington. He's claiming that Sloane was acting within his rights as a creditor, that the whole thing was a legitimate attempt to collect on debts owed to him. Clara felt sick. Can he do that? Can he make those charges disappear? He can try, Grady replied grimly, and with Sloane's money and influence he might succeed. The territorial government isn't exactly known for standing up to powerful men. So what does that mean for us? Clara asked, unconsciously holding Samuel tighter. It means you need to be prepared for a legal fight, the sheriff said. Sloane's not going to give up easily, and he's got resources we can't match. Jonah was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working, as he considered their options. Finally, he looked up at the sheriff with determination in his eyes. What if we had something Sloane wanted more than revenge? What do you mean? I mean the water rights to Silver Creek. Doc Mason told you about them, didn't he? Grady nodded slowly. He mentioned that your family had senior rights to the creek, said it could cut off water to Sloane's ranch. Not just his ranch, Jonah said. Half the valley depends on that water. If those rights were to be transferred to the community, made into some kind of public trust, it would protect everyone from Sloane's schemes. Clara stared at her husband in amazement. Jonah, are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying maybe it's time to stop thinking about what's mine and start thinking about what's ours, all of ours. He gestured toward the window beyond which the lights of Silver Creek twinkled in the darkness. These people stood up for us today. They deserve to be protected. Sheriff Grady scratched his head thoughtfully. That's a hell of a generous offer, Jonah, but would it be enough to get Sloane to back down? It might be, came a new voice from the doorway. Everyone turned to see Doc Mason entering the room, followed by an elderly man in an expensive suit that marked him as someone from outside their small community. This is Judge Harrison from the Territorial Court, Doc Mason explained. I took the liberty of sending a telegram to the Capitol after today's events. The judge rode out here as soon as he received it. Judge Harrison was a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He nodded politely to Clara and Jonah before turning to Sheriff Grady. I've been briefed on the situation, he said in a cultured voice that spoke of education and authority. Mr. Sloane's activities have come to the attention of the territorial government, and not in a positive way. What kind of attention? Grady asked. The kind that involves questions about land speculation, water rights manipulation, and possible fraud in several recent property acquisitions, the judge replied. Mr. Sloane has been under investigation for some time, but we haven't had enough evidence to proceed. Today's events, however, have provided exactly what we needed. Clara felt a surge of hope. Does that mean he'll be prosecuted? It means he's in serious trouble, Judge Harrison replied. But he's also a clever man with excellent lawyers. If we're going to make charges stick, we need ironclad evidence and unshakable witnesses. You have Billy Carter's testimony, Jonah pointed out. Yes, but Carter works for Sloane. A good defense attorney will argue that he's lying to save his own skin. We need more than that. Clara looked down at Samuel, who was sleeping peacefully, despite all the adult conversation swirling around him. She thought about the kind of world she wanted him to grow up in, a world where powerful men couldn't simply take what they wanted from those too weak to resist. What if you had Sloane's own words? She asked quietly. Everyone in the room turned to stare at her. What do you mean? Judge Harrison asked. I mean, what if there was a way to get him to confess, to admit what he's done in front of witnesses? Clara, Jonah said warningly, whatever you're thinking, "Hear me out," she interrupted. "Sloane's pride was hurt today, badly. He's angry and humiliated, and men like that make mistakes when they're emotional." Judge Harrison leaned forward with interest. "Go on." "He thinks he owns me." Clara continued, her voice growing stronger. "He's convinced that I belong to him by right, that Jonah stole his property. What if we gave him a chance to try to claim what he thinks is his?" "Absolutely not," Jonah said flatly. "I won't use you as bait." "You wouldn't be using me," Clara replied. "I'd be volunteering. There's a difference." "It's too dangerous," Doc Mason protested. "The man's clearly unstable." "Which is exactly why it might work," Judge Harrison said thoughtfully. "If we could arrange a controlled situation with plenty of witnesses and backup." "No," Jonah's voice was final. "I won't risk her life or Samuel's life for any scheme, no matter how well-intentioned." Clara understood his fear, but she also understood something else. As long as Barrett Sloane was free, none of them would ever be truly safe. The man's pride and obsession wouldn't allow him to simply give up and move on. "What if there was a way to do it safely?" she asked. "What if we could guarantee that I'd be protected?" Before anyone could answer, there was a commotion in the street outside. Voices were raised in anger, and someone was shouting orders. Jonah immediately moved to the window, his hand on his gun. "What is it?" Clara asked. "Sloane," Jonah replied grimly. "He's out there with a group of men. Looks like his lawyer got him released already." Judge Harrison moved to join Jonah at the window, his face darkening as he saw what was happening below. "Damn," he muttered. "I was afraid of this." Clara could hear Barrett Sloane's voice now raised in furious demand. "I know she's in there. I want to see her. I want to talk to the woman who murdered my deputy." "The man's completely lost his mind," Doc Mason observed. "Maybe," Judge Harrison said slowly, "or maybe this is exactly the opportunity we need." "What do you mean?" Sheriff Grady asked. "I mean Sloane's here in public making threats and demands. If we handle this right, we might be able to get him to incriminate himself in front of half the town." Clara struggled to sit up straighter, her mind racing. "Let me talk to him." "Clara, no," Jonah said immediately. "Listen to me," she insisted. "He's angry and not thinking clearly. If I can get him talking, get him to admit what he did." "It's too risky," Judge Harrison said. "Even with all of us here, he could have weapons, other men positioned around the building." "Then we make sure he doesn't," Clara replied. "Sheriff, can you guarantee his men will be disarmed?" Grady nodded slowly. "I've got enough deputies here to handle his crew, but Clara, if something goes wrong—" "It won't," she said with more confidence than she felt, "because I'm going to give him exactly what he wants to hear." "Which is what?" Doc Mason asked. Clara looked at each of the men in turn, then down at her sleeping son. "That he was right, that I do belong to him, that I made a mistake marrying Jonah." The room erupted in protests, but Clara held up her hand for silence. "Listen to me. Sloane's obsession isn't really about me. It's about winning, about being right. If I can make him think he's won, that I'm admitting he was right all along, his pride will make him want to gloat. And when men gloat, they reveal things they shouldn't." Judge Harrison stroked his chin thoughtfully. "It could work. If we had enough witnesses, if we could get him to admit to the fraud, the manipulation of your father's debts." "We could do more than that," Clara said, her voice growing stronger as the plan took shape in her mind. "We could get him to reveal his whole scheme. The water writes the plan to force out the small ranchers everything." "And if he doesn't take the bait?" Jonah asked, his voice tight with worry. "Then we're no worse off than we are now," Clara replied. "But if he does—" Outside, Sloane's voice was growing louder and more belligerent. "I know you can hear me in there. That woman belongs to me, and I'm not leaving without her." "We need to decide quickly," Sheriff Grady said. "The man's working himself into a frenzy, and my deputies won't be able to keep the peace much longer." Clara looked at Jonah, seeing the fear and love warring in his gray eyes. She understood his reluctance after everything they'd been through. The idea of voluntarily putting herself in danger must seem insane. But she also knew that this might be their only chance to end Sloane's threat permanently. As long as he was free, he would keep coming after them. His pride wouldn't allow anything else. "Trust me," she said softly, reaching out to take Jonah's hand. "I know what I'm doing." "Do you?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Because I can't lose you, Clara. I can't lose either of you." "You won't," she promised. "But I need you to trust me to handle this my way." For a long moment, Jonah said nothing. Then he leaned down and kissed her forehead gently. "All right, but I'm staying right beside you the whole time." "We all are," Judge Harrison added, "and the moment things look like they're going wrong, we end it." Clara nodded, then carefully transferred Samuel to Margaret's arms. The older woman had been silent throughout the discussion, but her face showed clear approval of Clara's courage. "You be careful, child," Margaret whispered, "and remember half this town is downstairs ready to defend you." As Clara prepared to go downstairs and face Barrett Sloane, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 2 days ago, she'd been powerless at the mercy of men who saw her as property to be bought and sold. Now she was about to voluntarily walk into danger, not as a victim, but as a woman fighting for her family and her community. "Ready?" Judge Harrison asked. Clara straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. "Ready." They made their way downstairs, where the main parlor had filled with townspeople who had heard the commotion and come to offer support. Clara saw faces she recognized. From the cabin, Jake Morrison, Mrs. Patterson, Reverend Wickham, and dozens of others. They looked at her with expressions of concern and admiration, and she drew strength from their presence. Sheriff Grady opened the front door, and Barrett Sloane's voice immediately filled the room. "Finally, I was beginning to think you were all cowards, hiding behind locked doors." "Nobody's hiding, Sloane," Grady replied calmly. "Mrs. Briggs has agreed to speak with you, but it'll be here in front of witnesses, and you'll keep a civil tongue in your head." Sloane pushed past the sheriff into the parlor, his expensive suit rumpled and his face flushed with anger and whiskey. Behind him came 2 men Clara didn't recognize, probably his lawyer and another hired gun. When Sloane's eyes fell on Clara, his expression changed from anger to something that made her skin crawl. It was the look of a man seeing something he considered his own property. "There you are," he said, his voice suddenly smooth and oily. "I was beginning to worry about you, my dear." "Mr. Sloane," Clara replied carefully, keeping her voice neutral. "You've caused quite a stir, haven't you?" Sloane continued, moving closer despite Jonah's warning growl. "Running off with this mountain man playing at being his wife. I hope you've gotten it out of your system." "I'm not playing at anything," Clara said. "I am his wife." Sloane laughed, the sound harsh and unpleasant. "A marriage performed under duress by a country doctor with no real authority. Please, my dear, we both know that little ceremony was nothing but theater." "The marriage is legal and binding," Judge Harrison interjected. "I've examined the documents myself." Sloane turned to stare at the judge, his eyes narrowing. "And you are Judge Harrison, Territorial Court. I'm here investigating reports of fraud and intimidation in this district." For the first time, Sloane looked uncertain, but his lawyer whispered something in his ear, and his confidence returned. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding, Your Honor. I'm simply trying to collect on legitimate debts owed to me by this woman's father." "By selling his daughter," Reverend Wickham stepped forward, his voice sharp with disapproval. "By accepting payment for services rendered," Sloane corrected smoothly. "The girl owed me money, and her father arranged for her to work it off. Perfectly legal." Clara felt her moment arriving. "Actually," she said quietly, "maybe you were right." Every head in the room turned toward her. Jonah made a small sound of surprise, but she squeezed his hand to silence him. "What do you mean?" Sloane asked, his eyes lighting up with interest. "I mean, maybe I did make a mistake," Clara continued, letting uncertainty creep into her voice. Maybe I should have listened to you in the first place." Sloane stepped closer and Clara could smell the whiskey on his breath. "Go on." "It's just, this isn't the life I expected. Living in a burned-out cabin, married to a man I barely know, with a baby to care for and no prospects." She let her voice trail off as if she couldn't bear to continue. "I knew it," Sloane said triumphantly. "I knew you'd come to your senses eventually. The mountain man can't provide for you the way I can." "But I've already married him," Clara said, injecting just the right note of helplessness into her voice. "The judge says it's legal." "Legal marriages can be annulled," Sloane's lawyer spoke up for the first time, "especially when they were performed under duress or based on fraud." "What kind of fraud?" Judge Harrison asked sharply. The lawyer seemed to realize he'd said too much, but Sloane was too caught up in his perceived victory to notice. "The kind where a man claims water rights he doesn't actually own," he said with a nasty smile. "The kind where someone forges documents to make themselves seem more prosperous than they are." "Are you saying Mr. Briggs doesn't own the water rights to Silver Creek?" Clara asked innocently. "I'm saying those rights will be mine soon enough," Sloane boasted. "I've been working on acquiring them for years. Your father's debts were just the first step." The room had gone very quiet. Clara could feel the tension building as people began to understand what Sloane was revealing. "The first step to what?" she asked. "To owning this entire valley," Sloane said, his voice growing louder as his excitement built. "Do you have any idea how much money there is to be made in water rights? How much power I can control every ranch, every farm, every business from here to the territorial capital? By manipulating people's debts," Judge Harrison asked quietly. "By using perfectly legal business practices." Sloane corrected, but his tone was defensive now. "If people can't pay their bills, that's hardly my fault. Even when you're the one who creates those bills." Clara pressed gently. Sloane turned back to her, his eyes bright with the fervor of a man convinced of his own brilliance. "A good businessman creates opportunities, my dear. Your father, for instance, he was drinking away his profits long before I ever gave him credit. I simply accelerated the process." "By selling him whiskey on credit?" Reverend Wickham asked, his voice tight with anger. "By providing a service to a man who desperately wanted it," Sloane replied. "If he chose to drink himself into debt, that was his decision." "And then you arranged for his daughter to be auctioned off to pay those debts," Judge Harrison said. "It wasn't a question. I arranged for a business transaction that would have benefited everyone involved," Sloane said defensively. "The girl would have had a comfortable home, her father's debts would have been paid, and I would have acquired certain assets that would have helped expand my business interests." Clara felt sick hearing him talk about her as if she were a piece of property, but she forced herself to keep playing her part. "What kind of assets?" Sloane smiled at her, the expression predatory and cold. "Marriage rights, my dear. As your husband, I would have controlled your inheritance, including any claim you might have to mountain property through your association with Mr. Briggs. But I don't have any claim to Jonah's property," Clara said, confused. "Ah, but you do now," Sloane replied triumphantly. "As his wife, you have legal rights to his holdings. And when your marriage is annulled for fraud, those rights will transfer to your legitimate husband, me." The room erupted in angry voices, but Judge Harrison's command cut through the noise. "Silence." He turned to face Sloane with ice in his eyes. "Mr. Sloane, are you admitting to conspiracy to commit fraud?" For the first time, Sloane seemed to realize that he might have said too much. His lawyer was frantically trying to get his attention, but it was too late. "I'm admitting to nothing illegal," Sloane said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Really?" Clara asked sweetly, "because it sounds like you've been planning this for a long time. Creating my father's debts, arranging for my auction, sending Deputy Wilson to attack our cabin when your first plan failed." "Wilson acted on his own," Sloane said quickly. "I never authorized any violence." That's not what Billy Carter says. Sheriff Grady spoke up. According to him, you planned the whole thing, including getting rid of Jonah permanently. Sloane's face went pale. Carter's a liar, a drunk and a liar. Maybe, Judge Harrison said, but he's not the only witness anymore. This entire room just heard you admit to manipulating debts, conspiracy to defraud, and attempting to acquire property through illegal means. You tricked me, Sloane snarled, turning on Clara with fury in his eyes. You little bitch, you made me think that you'd won. Clara interrupted, her voice no longer sweet and helpless, but strong and clear. That you could manipulate me the way you manipulated my father. I'm sorry to disappoint you, Mr. Sloane, but I'm not for sale. Not now, not ever. Sloane lunged toward her, his face twisted with rage, but Jonah stepped between them with deadly grace. His fist connected with Sloane's jaw with a sound like an axe hitting wood, and the older man crumpled to the floor. That, Jonah said quietly, is for calling my wife a bitch. Sheriff Grady was already moving, handcuffs in hand. Barrett Sloane, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, attempted kidnapping, and about a dozen other charges I'll think of on the way to jail. As the sheriff hauled Sloane to his feet, the defeated man's eyes found Clara's one last time. This isn't over, he said venomously. You think you've won, but it's over, Clara interrupted firmly. Your greed and pride brought you down, Mr. Sloane. No one else to blame. As Sloane was led away in handcuffs, followed by his panicked lawyer, the parlor erupted in cheers and applause. Clara found herself surrounded by people offering congratulations and praise for her courage. But all she wanted was to return to Jonah and Samuel, to hold her family close and begin the process of truly healing from everything they'd endured. Judge Harrison approached her as the crowd began to disperse. That was brilliantly done, Mrs. Briggs. Your testimony, combined with what we heard tonight, should be enough to put Sloane away for a very long time. What will happen to his property? Clara asked. His ranch, his other holdings. That will depend on the extent of his fraudulent activities, the judge replied. But I suspect much of it will be returned to the people he cheated, including your father if he's willing to testify about how his debts were manipulated. Clara thought about her father, drunk and bitter and broken by his own choices, as much as by Sloane's manipulation. I'll talk to him, she said quietly. Maybe this can be a new beginning for him too. As the evening finally wound down and the last of the visitors departed, Clara found herself alone with Jonah in their borrowed room. Samuel was sleeping peacefully in his cradle, unaware of the drama that had secured his future. Are you all right? Jonah asked, pulling Clara into his arms. Better than all right, she replied, melting into his embrace. We're free, Jonah, really, truly free. Thanks to you, he said, pressing his lips to her hair. What you did tonight took incredible courage. What we did, Clara corrected, all of us together, that's what made the difference, the community standing up to protect what's right. They stood together in comfortable silence, holding each other and watching their son sleep. Outside the window, Silver Creek was settling into peaceful quiet, no longer under the shadow of Barrett Sloane's schemes. So what now? Clara asked eventually. Now we rebuild, Jonah replied. The cabin, our life, our future. We make it everything we want it to be. Together, he confirmed, always together. Clara looked down at the simple gold band on her finger, the ring that had belonged to Jonah's mother. When he'd first placed it there, it had been a symbol of convenience, protection, necessity. Now it represented something far more precious: love, partnership, family, home. I love you, Jonah Briggs, she whispered. I love you too, Clara Briggs, he replied, and I promise you, our story is just beginning. As if in agreement, Samuel stirred in his sleep and made a soft, contented sound. His parents smiled down at him, this miracle of new life, born from such unlikely circumstances. Outside, snow began to fall, gently dusting the town with winter's first kiss. But inside the warm room, three hearts beat in harmony, bound together by love stronger than fear, hope deeper than despair, and faith in a future they would build together. The pregnant girl who had been sold like livestock was gone, transformed into a woman who had found her strength, her voice, and her place in the world. The mountain man who had hidden from life had become a husband and father, his heart open to love again. And somewhere in the territory, a judge was preparing cases that would ensure Barrett Sloane never again threatened innocent people with his greed and cruelty. But those were tomorrow's concerns. Tonight, Clara Briggs held her family close and whispered prayers of gratitude for silver dollars and second chances, for the mysterious ways that God could turn the worst moments into the beginning of the best ones. The story that had begun with shame and desperation had become a tale of redemption and love. And as the snow fell softly on Silver Creek, it covered the scars of the past and promised a future as clean and bright as the mountain dawn.